All right, so I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here again. Auron MacIntyre, thank you for coming on our show. It has been a little bit of time since we've spoken, and I am grateful that you're here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Great talking to you guys again.
There's been a kind of lot of stuff that's happened in between the last time we spoke, namely the presidential election. So we've got, I feel like, a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, certainly no lack of events coming at us, especially after the Trump victory here. So
It's a Thanksgiving feast of topics here,
a
for sure.
cornucopia of news.
There we go. Thank you.
All right, well, happy holidays, happy Thanksgiving to you and to all of our listeners.
Yeah, man.
But yeah, we've got a handful of topics here. Aaron, I've wanted to talk with you for a while. I've been listening to your podcast series and kind of just been poking in and out here and there, but I've been really interested in a lot of the stuff you've been doing about like, uh, postmodern traditionalism, and then also some of the stuff about Nick Land and Dugin. It's kind of all up my alley. So I've been keeping tabs on you. I've been working up a list of things to talk about. But I feel like first, before we jump into all that, we can kind of maybe just, I mean, I know everyone's been talking about the election a good bit and the fallout from the election and everything. So I don't want to maybe spend too much time on it, but I think you have probably a perspective that you could offer our listeners that maybe they don't get from Slav and I. So I just wanted to see if you have any kind of just like overarching thoughts on the way that the election panned out and kind of what it looks like for the Trump coalition, like in the next few months, as far as, just
Right.
kind of building consensus and coming around like each other and soliding that up a little bit.
Well, and also to springboard on that, if I can, just stitch a little bit extra onto there. Like, it was quite the win, and we're a couple weeks out now, and I'm just wondering like how everybody's morale is, right? Because I was buzzing for a while there, and now it's kind of starting to normalize down to a kind of a hum. And yeah, I'm just wondering how you're feeling about it.
Yeah, it's always interesting. Winning the peace is often much more difficult than the war itself.
Mm,
And this is particularly true for quote unquote dissident movements. It's one thing to push back, it's another thing to rule. And so, the how is the average person feeling who is a Trump supporter out in the world? I think they're happy. The symptom that conservatives always suffer from, and this is true of human nature in general, but specifically the conservative movement, has never really been able to sustain its energy past an election. So they tend to just kind of elect somebody and then say, okay, we're going to go back to grilling. Hope you fixed everything.
mhm.
And this is something that the left just has on the right. They know that they were working towards a revolution, and because they were working towards a revolution, they could not just win an election and then say we're done. They needed to capture territory constantly. They needed to make sure every institution, everything that defined the culture and really everything about the United States was constantly being remade. Because conservatives sit in this position of assuming that the institutions are ultimately kind of default set to their interests, they don't feel that same need to constantly involve themselves, push forward. That doesn't mean that the left doesn't go through waves. Of course, we're seeing a kind of a demoralization wave of the left now.
Yeah.
But the right really has a problem of staying focused after a victory. I think the average conservative is just kind of like, okay, great, he's in office. We'll be doing better. For kind of the online right, people who are a little more constantly focused, you can kind of see themselves currently tearing themselves apart about like random memes and these things. Like
Mm,
Trump won a victory, but it's a bunch of like, his picks are going to be terrible, and his we're going to lose all this, and maybe there's some other aspect of the culture we should go fight about because drama is actually the real driver of this and not any particular political objective. And so I would say, things are good in the sense that a lot of people are optimistic that of kind of where Trump might take them. But I think the fact that one the people with no passion are the ones who would probably be happiest and do something positive with passion if they had it. and the people with passion are mainly spinning their wheels and trying to
Uh,
tear each other apart at the moment. So that's a
many
bit of a
such
problem.
cases. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
many such cases.
Well, that's interesting because there's been obviously there was a lot of energy around Trump in the campaign in this election. It seemed pretty obvious that he was going to win it from pretty much all metrics except for the polls. They seemed to kind of slag behind reality like they
Much to
always
everyone's
do.
surprise.
Yeah. So it seems like there was a super high energy around it, and then also like this huge kind of burst of energy at the actual election, and with the major victory. I mean, winning the popular vote, winning the electoral college in huge margin, and so it seems like there is this huge energy around it. But it's I wonder, is it sustainable? Is it something that can be built upon long term? Is it something that it's like a bubble that now that the elections happen, it's going to burst? And I know that's something that you were kind of speaking to there. But something that really kind of interests me is looking at the coalition that's kind of been hobbled around Trump and the Trump campaign. It's kind of got a bunch of different factions in it. And it seems like
Mhm.
now the action kind of turns towards like infighting amongst those factions. And how is that going to tear apart or kind of recenter this coalition moving forward through the second term and even beyond the second term?
Yeah, there's this moment, the thing about Trump, the reason that he was refreshing but also dangerous to conservative establishment is he's a thoroughly non-ideological character.
Hmm.
You just look at his cabinet picks, right? Like you've got Tulsi Gabbard and
Hmm.
RFK alongside all kinds of like super arch conservatives. Um, and so in a way, Trump's power comes from the fact that he is doing what a politician or a leader is actually supposed to do, which is look at the people who he's serving and saying, "What do you want?" He's
Hmm.
not telling them, "Hey, you need free trade and open borders and blah blah blah." Like, who cares if your job goes to China? Creative destruction. Like he is saying, actually, no. The people of America seem to want fewer wars, healthier food. The idea that a government would care for them and put their priorities first and protect their living and their well-being. Like these are things that the middle of the country is actually asking for, so I'm going to deliver them. Inside of that, you have highly ideological coalitions kind of vying for the machinery of the Trump presidency.
Yeah.
Because most people recognize this is what actually rules. Trump will be likely the figurehead, but the idea that he is going to isolate specific policies and advance them on a like disciplined basis just kind of ignores the things we know about Donald Trump. And so inside of that, we have battles between kind of the remnants of Con Inc., neoconservatives,
Hmm.
insurgent national populists, paleocons. There, the fact that Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and therefore Curtis Yarvin are actually relatively close to power means there's a real like neo-reactionary wing inside this, which is kind of wild. Like I remember talking to you guys several years ago when you're doing the Fed Post thing, and we were joking about the possibility of any of these guys even being mildly aware
Right.
of neo-reactionary thought. And now, yesterday, Elon Musk responded to Nick Land, and
Oh
Mark
yeah,
Andreessen retweeted my pointing this fact out.
Yeah.
That's kind of a wild moment to live in, but
majorly.
those are the different factions that I think are currently kind of vying for the actual structure of the Trump presidency.
Interesting. Because that was going to be my next question, was like how we would define those factions. And that's an interesting thing you just pointed out because, and I'm just kind of riffing here a little bit, but I remember on election night, I was talking to my wife and I was just kind of saying, like, this feels like the end of a very, very long story arc. In some ways, right? I mean, this is just the beginning in many others, right? But 2020 kind of being that dark middle chapter
Mm.
for then the return here. And there was, breaking my arm, giving myself a pat on the back here. I think there were a lot of factors in which a lot of the things that all of us here were talking about a few years ago ended up being absolutely the case, right? And kind of what you're talking about, just as far as like the relevancy of certain thinkers. And I look at as hesitant as I am to play into the like, oh, we're gonna win over the based blacks and the more diverse voter base or whatever. Like, I look at the electoral map and I see fucking the Nixon and a Koofy meme, like just the changes that took place. I feel a little bit like we can all, and not just us here, but just everybody in general, like a little bit of a Babe Ruth moment there. It was kind of gratifying, especially when 2020 felt like such a departure. And it felt a little bit like, I remember 2020 happening and being like, I've been huffing fucking gasoline. And now obviously, fortifications aside, yeah, it was interesting. It's almost like we kind of just skipped 4 years. And this was actually what was meant to happen. I'm kind of just stumbling into my next question here, but how has it been looking at this second chapter in 2020 fortification? People kind of going back and going, what actually did happen there? I know myself looking at normies and looking at libs and being like, listening to them say like, maybe we did fucking steal this shit, which has been a lot more it's been a lot more widespread than I ever would have thought. Like,
what happened to those like 30 million voters? They just disappeared. Like,
exactly. I mean, what are your thoughts on so just strange. Watching that play out?
Yeah, I mean, the primary question, a lot of people, this election was a lot of things. It's a referendum on Donald Trump, and it's a question about our future and all these things. But like the most important question of this election really was, are elections real? Like, are we ever going to have a real election again? Because you watch something like 2020, and that really is a question, and especially after the Democrats tried to assassinate Donald Trump multiple times.
Yeah.
After trying to throw the man in jail and bankrupt him and strip him off the ballot. A lot of people will say, well, what happened to the election fortification in 2024? And I'm like, which bullet are you talking about? Like we had plenty of attempts by the Democrats to change the course of the election in 2024, both in far more serious ways than the soft power that came from manipulating Twitter or the ballot harvesting and these kind of things. So I don't think 2024 was actually any more of a wild election than 2020. But I do think what we saw is the fact that there is a certain level of plausible deniability. They need to pull off what they did in 2020, which no one was ready for it. We had the events of COVID and the riots and everything else, which gave them a lot of cover. But in addition to that, like, there also needs to be a certain margin within that they can actually do the fortification in.
Too big to rig this one.
The too big to rig was a meme, but it's also, what do we know at this point? Memes are real life, right? Like, if you can generate enough of an advantage where it's incredibly difficult. Again, like, they were still, counting fake votes in Pennsylvania. To the point where the governor, who was a Democrat, had to be like, okay, guys, this is getting embarrassing. So it's not like the Democrats are like just lost their roadmap to how to do this. But ultimately, like, there is a limit in which, and this is the problem with a theory of pure power. There's been a debate ongoing inside kind of the Italian elite theory school, or whatever you want to call it, between myself and my buddy Nima Parvini about like whether power is completely unrestrained and that's all there is, or if power matters and elites matter, but ultimately there is like a certain narrative in which power must exist.
Yeah.
And the fact that power can move the needle 5 or 6 points on an election is huge. Like, that's a lot of power. That's where most elections exist. But the fact that power cannot ignore an election or cannot move, the results 10% does matter. It means there is some narrative inside of which power must operate. It needs a legitimacy that it cannot generate wholly in and of itself. And that's important when we're kind of trying to analyze what happened here.
Yeah.
100%. It kind of reminds me of like um like the blood doping controversy with like Lance Armstrong or something, right? Like he wasn't completely blowing it all out of the water or whatever, but it's just whatever small things you can do to shave off and get an advantage, even a small one, when things are so optimized. A small one is tremendous, right? It's an interesting point. It's an interesting point. I think that uh, the way I've kind of thought about it as well has been, if the Dems political machine is kind of like an organism, the energy expenditure of such a vast, even if it is a small difference that's made, like we're talking about, the expenditure that it takes to rig something that widespread is like it's a pretty onerous cost. And I think coming off of 4 Trump years, when it was, has there ever been a time in American history where they had that big of a windfall with fundraising? I can't think of anything. Like,
Yeah, I don't know enough about the historic fundraising numbers, but it is interesting that so much of that cost for the 2020 election actually seemed to be backloaded. So, for instance, Zuckerberg was on board with basically buying the local election apparatus for many, many different counties across the country, right? Like, if you want to read Molly Hemingway's book Rigged, she's not talking about like balance counted at 3 a.m., though she's not discounting that, but she's outlaying the kind of structural factors that were in the open that we can look at and see what happened during that election. And she goes through kind of the process of him buying all that stuff. Well, this year Zuckerberg says, actually, no, I am a libertarian and maybe I like America and Trump seems cool. And that shift from like literally buying up the election apparatus for Joe Biden 4 years ago to saying, oh, well, I need to move into a neutral space is not an accident. He's not doing that because he's has some change of heart. Like the man is, built out of computer circuitry.
Yeah.
The reason, or lizard parts, whatever. But the reason he did that was it became so clear that the credibility cost of organizations that went all in on this manipulation of reality was incredibly high. And at the end of the day, Zuckerberg is not an ideologue, he's a robot. And so he will do what's going to be best overall for his own personal power. When he thought buying all in on the winning side was the way to do this, he took that action. But when he recognized that there was a significant cost to himself and his organization and their credibility, he said, okay, well, maybe moving away from this is the way to go. And so Democrats, in many ways were building themselves up to continue kind of their march through the institutions and their domination. And what they found at the end of this was that they had made a lot of promises they couldn't keep to a lot of organizations that ultimately didn't care about their ideology and really only cared about profit and power.
Yeah.
And when they got to the end of the cycle and there was simply nothing left for them to secure, they said, well, maybe we'll roll the dice with the other guy.
Yeah, it's interesting. You saw that move kind of with not just Zuckerberg, but some of the media institutions with like not, choosing to endorse Kamala. You also see that. I mean, you have Elon Musk now, who's kind of in the Trump camp, and he wasn't so much beforehand. The acquisition of X and everything was a pretty big factor as well. And so it does seem like there was kind of a movement there. And it may be that they just kind of see like, all right, well, what we're doing right now is like not sustainable for us maintaining our ability to have our individual empires either. Even though a lot of the things are swinging our way as far as like global trade and stuff, there's matters on the home front that are kind of ripping apart the nation. And I kind of do rely, as much as I try to be multinational and outside the scope of a nation, kind of do rely upon the home nation in some capacity, as far as like a brand upon which you can build your kind of industry, and as well as just kind of like the place where you come from. And so I do think that that's like an interesting thing. I do think also I mentioned this to SLAV, but you mentioned how you're talking about is power kind of contained in some capacity to a narrative? Does it have to operate within a certain thing? In other words,
Mm.
I'm kind of thinking of that as like, does it need the facade of liberal democracy to maintain heading in the direction that it is right now? Because right now it seems like this facade of a liberal democracy, where it's like, oh, actually the people are in control and everything. It very much so decentralizes our understanding of where power resides, and it's a very good camouflage for powers that be to maintain doing the things that they're doing without ever really being identified as the structures themselves. And I think that this election, even though they were telling you need to vote for Kamala to save democracy, which we all know how ridiculous that was, it seems as though this election itself kind of did, for better or for worse, save democracy in a sense, because like, if you were to just outright rig this one again, there's a lot of people who just fully wouldn't have any faith in the democratic process in America going forward. It was already declining in such a major capacity. And then now, you have Trump, he wins in a landslide. He wins the popular vote and everything. And it's kind of like, oh, like you said, oh, elections do kind of work, or do they? And it's kind of, I'm not necessarily someone who loves liberal democracy. And so I kind of, bemoan it a little bit, but it does seem like it kind of shored it up again.
Yeah, the Kamala Harris accelerationist option was certainly on the table, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're exactly correct that ultimately another demonstration of the regime's willingness to burn all credibility in order to kind of maintain formal power would have been probably the death knell of in any belief in democracy in the United States. Like, we'd still have democracy in the sense that like Saddam Hussein held elections,
Yeah.
but the idea that democracy confers legitimacy would more or less died there on the table. And so now we're in this moment where, I'm happy that my nation will not be going through, I think, what would have been a much worse scenario. And I'm also very happy that there's this moment, if we treat it correctly, where people on the right, or those that just kind of oppose what's been going on, can organize, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you treat this next 4 years as a reprieve rather than a victory, then you have the right mentality. You can recognize this as a moment to build and organize, create stronger communities, stronger organizations, try to devolve as much power as you can down to regionalities and states. Create maybe you even get a few things done in the Trump administration. Maybe you actually do, I don't know, get rid of the Department of Education or deport a few people. I don't know how much of that is actually going to get done, but if you treat this as a moment for you to make those gains and secure yourself for the next round of battle, then you have a better understanding of where you are. If you treat this as like, well, democracy worked and now the good guys are in charge and they'll go fix everything, like, that's dumb. But it is, you're right, exactly, like that is how people will treat it. Many people will treat it that way. And the question is, like, how many of us can kind of keep people focused on actually, no, the problem is not solved, and no, that doesn't mean I'm blackpilling. I'm actually just trying to get you to like have some interest in what's going to happen after Trump is gone. The and uh, you know, if you're just electing this guy and thinking that solves a problem, and that's the lesson you learn from this election, then yeah, this was a wasted opportunity.
How much do you think that those different factions, kind of competing for the influence within this administration and within this kind of coalition, how much do you think that will impede the ability to strengthen, like you said, or do you think it'll actually be like an iron sharpens iron kind of scenario, that can help to kind of like close ranks a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Yarvid himself has been pretty down on the Trump win, the Trump victory, though he might be playing a certain level of like, "Hey, I'm going to bait you into doing the things you should be doing by kind of mocking you." So I don't want
Yeah.
to, I don't want to preclude the idea that Yarvin is aware that maybe they are going to go a little further and just wants to goad them into going the whole 9 yards.
Mm-hmm.
But his point has been basically that if you approach this presidency with the idea that you're going to like get in there and fix the bureaucracy and these things, like, that's a disaster. Like, that's not going to happen. That's not how the government works. If your plan is to go there and demand from the American people, like, I need the authority to dismantle this stuff, then that's a different a different way to approach it, and possibly more successful. So if there's a understanding that the only reason to appoint anyone to the Department of Education is to close the door and put and bulldoze the thing, then you have a success there. But if you're putting people in there thinking like we're going to put our own based curriculum in there, like no, you won't. That is not what's going to happen. And if the sparring between these different factions encourages people to ultimately be like, okay, well, we can't fix this, so the only thing to do is to shut it down and rebuild, then that's great. If it just ends up being a bunch of guys looking to see who can tunnel further into the deep state, that's destructive. It gets you nowhere.
It's funny. So my wife works in education, and there's kind of no middle ground there. Like, you're either just the most paused up, like, foot soldier imaginable, or you like are like just, or they're like actively the most racist woman you've ever met. And she's loving this, getting rid of the Department of Education thing. And it's quite funny talking to normies we know who like kind of just are aghast by it, because it's just like they don't really know what that even entails, really.
Yeah.
And honestly, how little that will actually affect the lives of anyone they know, in ways that they're expecting. And so that's been very like encouraging. And it's very funny to watch her she's fired up about it. She loves it. But what you were just talking about is really interesting. It obviously brings up, we've mentioned it many times, and I'm a fucking idiot, so I'm gonna reference it incorrectly. But the Lenin line, right, about like, I don't, you don't need to learn the machine, you can just smash it. And I've gotten a little uneasy. I'm not the biggest fan of Elon, okay, and I'm frustrated because disliking Elon has now become coded as like the most annoying, embarrassing thing to do in the world.
Funko Pop collector energy.
Exactly. So I'm quietly,
Are you telling me you don't like the latest Star Wars movie?
Right. And so, but I see his involvement, which I'm coming to grips with just how fucking profoundly important his involvement was in winning the election. And that I wouldn't have expected that originally. And I'm just seeing between him and a lot of other factors, there seems to be a pretty strong libertarian streak running through what's going on right now. And I don't love that. I'm not the biggest fan of libertarians, but at the same time, when you're putting it this way, as far as just like, no, the thing to do is to cut things back and to smash them instead of make these little tweaks and put, like you said, base curriculum in place to a fundamentally broken structure. I almost wonder if like having that libertarian streak is a good idea, if that first order of business is just disassembling things. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So, the problem, the problem with libertarians, and they're going to love me when I start this sentence, but the problem with libertarians is that they are as utopian as communists. And they hate that, but it's very true. The state is as real a truth about human nature as like the profit incentive is. And you cannot remove the state's existence from human social organization. As soon as you think you've broken it, it will simply reform itself somewhere else, like the Terminator, right? Like just as you cannot remove hierarchy in the way that communists want to remove it from human existence, you cannot remove the reality of the state. And so, just as, Marx had some points to be made about like the problems of capital accumulation and the challenges that it would, put towards humans, libertarians
got him, boys.
Clip that.
And now I'm fired from the board. No,
we got him. Get Glenn back on the line now.
Yeah, it's all over. Yeah. Somewhere James Lindsay is clipping that and slamming a repeat button.
Woke right.
It's all over for me, boys. But just as that is true to some extent, the libertarians have some reasonable points about the distortion that state influence has on human life.
Mm-hmm.
And their desire to reduce that is correct in theory. The problem is that most libertarians don't understand that is not then a throwing off all order, in the same way that throwing off all capitalism will not solve your problems of like modernity, right? Like that
Yes.
did not fix the problems of in any of the countries in which it was tried, and the attempt to disassemble the state will not fix any of those problems either. The problem of politics is people. And the problem is you can't get people out of politics no matter how hard you try. And so, the solution, the ancient solution to the overreach of the state is the virtue of the people. It is the ability of the people to do the things that the state would do for them, so the state does not take those responsibilities and therefore that sovereignty. But that requires a recognition of authority and hierarchy. You don't need a state to care for the poor because your church and community care for the poor. You don't need to have a standing army because that will encourage you to create an empire and go on foreign adventures and wars, because you have a citizen militia of men who are virtuous enough to drill and defend your nation. Like, this is what the founding fathers and everyone who envisioned what a republic was, going back to Machiavellian Aristotle. Like, these were key features of like what made self-governance possible. And so like you can't just get rid of everything and then have nothing to catch it. So like the idea of libertarians is we'll just smash the public school system and we'll smash the social safety net and we'll smash all this stuff and then that'll solve the problem. And no, it won't. People will just die. Like that's not the solution. Like the solution to getting rid of these departments is you need to have a populace engaged in kind of these voluntary associations that resolve those issues without state interference. And until you've built up that alternative structure of institutions, the state institutions will continue to exist. So if you smash the Department of Education, that's great, but then you need to have 50 states that are ready to handle what the Department of Education handled. Now, the great thing about the Department of Education is it's just cancer. So you can cut it out because it literally does nothing. Like every time I talk to someone who is very concerned about the end of the Department of Education, I'm like, explain to me what this does that you are worried about. And they never have an answer. Like, they're like, well, kids won't learn stuff. Like, I was a teacher for many years. Let me explain to you how this actually works. But there are government departments that do handle things that actually exist, and you need to be ready. Like, you can't just smash the welfare system without having something for people to fall back on. Yeah. If you have not created the social safety net, you can't just throw it away. And so there's a scenario where like libertarians are right about some of the problem, but all of their solutions kind of ignore human nature. And so in the sense that Elon and the libertarian guys are engaged in like dismantling these super superfluous things like the Department of Education, they're doing great. And even when they're getting to some of the more core stuff, if they could figure out ways to dismantle this while, distributing that responsibility back to a virtuous population, that would be great too. But that takes a lot more than just being like, we cut the government. Like that is not sufficient to solve your issue. Sorry, I went on forever there. But...
Oh, you're fine.
Oh no, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I think like I often like to think about this stuff as, and again, I mean, if I was like a libertarian in the inner circle, I wouldn't necessarily like my role being reduced to what I'm about to say, but I like the idea of just like everybody can have some kind of role to play, right? And I think that instrumentalizing libertarians to be like, okay, you're the guy that comes in and does the demo. You're not going to build the cabinets, And I think that they probably have more of an interest in just an open floor plan without any cabinets.
Yeah.
But like, we're not going to do that because that's retarded. And so like, I think backing just to emphasize what you were saying, like bringing them in with the sledgehammer and then actually having maybe someone with a little bit more intellectual rigor. Maybe partially I'm trying to take all the possible hate from libertarians and just direct it at me from you. But no, someone like actually maybe a little bit more serious about building in a positive way, I think is absolutely serious. I'm totally a COH, unless you had something on the topic to say.
Yeah.
Oh,
I've
go
got
ahead.
just a quick thing. I like the idea of like you have a virtuous populace, and then it's like they can pick up the, the slack that's cut from the state, and like people can fall back on their communities, they can fall back on their church or whatever. But the problem is that it seems as though, I mean, it very much so. These communities and the church and everything has been very much so dismantled through a process of like, deconstruction and like capital accumulation that kind of go hand in hand. And so it makes me wonder, like, how likely is it to actually build up these institutions in order to have something to fall back on when the state is cut like that? Or is it just opening up a void for, like techno capitalists to kind of come in and establish new markets, establish, new circuits for capital accumulation that don't actually serve the populace in a meaningful way? And like, what is that? Because to me, it's like if you don't have those institutions built up in that way and you don't have a populace that's connected to each other and to the land they live on and their communities in a meaningful capacity, then it seems like it will devolve into that pretty
Right.
immediately.
Yeah, this is a huge issue, and there are already a lot of kind of the tech optimists, kind of the techno commercialists that you're talking about, trying to figure out how to like automate away the problem of like the managerial class.
Yeah.
Like this is their solution. The problem is not that capital has deracinated us and we've lost the ability to organize ourselves into virtuous communities that identify and care for each other. The problem is like the dehumanizing force we embraced through industrial scale like is getting in the way of more rapid accumulation and development, and so we should just automate them out of the problem. The truth, as difficult as it is that the managerial elite were really just the last gasp of the human security system
Yeah.
on unattached capital, right? Like this is
Ugh.
really as like
That's
horrible.
that actually is like genuinely kind of chilling to me.
like as horrible as they were, like ultimately they were basically like human interests zooming out as much as possible in an attempt to capture what was left
Hmm.
of their control. I mean, think of what
Yep.
every one of these people is trying to do right now. All of them simultaneously, from like John Kerry to Keir Starmer to whoever is running whatever dystopian like Anglophile nation across the world, Canada, Justin Trudeau. Like they're all trying to basically censor the internet as fast as possible right
Yeah.
now,
Right.
because that's like here's the last gasp of like identifiable national sovereignty trying to hold on to what is the ultimate weapon in our current world, which is information and propaganda. And so like these systems are freeing themselves faster than our elites can mutate humanity to like capture them. um and so where was I going with that? I've lost it.
Well, no, it's okay because that just got me thinking on something that's really interesting to me, which is, in this era now, I mean, it's like this like weird post left, like we like COH and I often talk about how do we even articulate our own values in this current landscape, and I think that there's a certain level of that that's healthy, um, and it's just interesting because while I still like largely identify um, with my own little personal conception of what would be left-wing thought, and I think there's a bunch of things you could say about that are funny, but at the end of the day, at least for myself, and I have a sneaking suspicion this is accurate for him as well, I think that so much of this it kind of can be simplified down to just being like, I think that a central command economy is an immediate way for humanity to actually have control over their destiny outside of this like machine god that has like captured us, right? And this idea you're saying of like managerialism being this last gasp in having control is just so it's totally true, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's so bleak, and it makes me see this parallel with my adversaries that makes me kind of uneasy, right? I'm not necessarily building up to a question with that or anything, but it is just kind of funny. At COH, I'm going to interview you for half a second. I just like wonder like how much of that you agree with and what you think about that, because yeah.
I mean, I definitely 100%. I view like the managerial class in the same way as being kind of a last vestige of the human security system, and that's kind of what I think the order of the day is for me. That's what I wanted to talk so much about, and I'm happy that we've now pivoted into discussion of Nick Land and human security system type stuff, because to me, like that's one thing that I really appreciate about you, Aaron, is that although you and I think come from different lineages of thought, you are someone who is willing to kind of take some like maybe postmodern thought or maybe even some semi proto Marxist kind of thought and engage with it in a way that's not necessarily accepting the premises of it, or the base foundations of it or anything, but getting kind of what's useful out of it and moving from there and using it to inform your own kind of politics and your own worldview, and at least inform you about what like quote unquote the other side is thinking. And that's something that I find myself wanting to do that, but kind of from the other angle a lot of the time. And so, like, when I start thinking about the human security system, I start thinking about capital kind of like untethered. Um, I think the reading of like, Nick Land or whatever, any kind of accelerationist reading of capital accumulation is kind of like leading to the point of, okay, there were traditional societies that had traditional relations in place, and these traditional relations were kind of like a enclosure system for capital, and they kind of kept it within a certain bounds, and it slowed it down, or it kind of contained it. It's like a containment mechanism for capital, and that as we have moved into modernity, it's kind of smashed a lot of those traditional relations. It rebuilt modern relations, which were a little bit more suited for capital to kind of accumulate and run amok, like i.e. global liberalism, global open markets and that kind of thing. And we've kind of moved even further now into postmodernism, where it's kind of like breaking down even those relations that were established in the modern era. And so it's left like these gaping voids for capital to kind of to fill. It's like deterritorialized all of these things that are basic human relations and goods, and it's then created markets out of those things. And I think that the consequences of that are the things that motivate us politically in a lot of ways. Like people on the right are very much so concerned about the destruction of traditional ties like the family unit, the church, religious structures, institutions, that kind of thing. And then people on the left are concerned about like kind of capital filling that void and creating these markets and everything. And I think that they're inextricably linked in a very serious way. And so I think that the reading is kind of like capital is working to emancipate itself from kind of human bondage in a way, and it wants to kind of have us created like this new boundless body where it can kind of roam free. Everything is reterritorialized into the market, and no longer kind of, it's now post-human kind of thing. And I think that there's like obviously the accelerationist kind of point of view that's like, let's just punch through that. There's nothing we can do and move into a post-human kind of world. But me as a human being, I don't like that. I'm pro-human. I'm anti-capital in the sense that I think it's kind of set up in a dichotomy with humanity in a meaningful way. And so it kind of, I think there's kind of two takeaways. That's like either kind of smash through or try to reassemble the human security system. And it seems as though maybe many people that kind of use this on the right use it as like a way to say we need to reintroduce traditionalism. We need to reestablish a human security system. Is that something that I'm kind of right on picking up, or is that not a direction that you're kind of thinking in?
No, it is. The interesting thing about postmodern thought is how right wing it is when you like kind of remove all the left wing garbage assumptions that underlie it.
Hmm.
So for instance, like Deleuze and Guattari are really excited about the ability of capital to deterritorialize
Yeah.
things. Actually, they're not. That's not a problem for them because they don't like traditional identities. They think they're oppressive. They think humanity needs to be freed from their ultimate goal is human emancipation. And
Yeah.
so to the extent which capitalism deterritorializes, that's great. It's the reterritorialization they don't like. And so they're hoping, and this is the case with so many postmoderns, they hope that if they kind of break things down to their constituent parts, then that will like alleviate the structures or weaken the structures so severely that they'll kind of shatter under the pressure, and then we'll reestablish ourselves as like whatever horrible pedophilic thing that Foucault was trying to get to.
Mm.
And like actually, if you look at this, what they've done is assembled kind of the constituent parts of what it means to have a society and
Yeah.
what defines these things. And if you start from the premise that actually uh, human emancipation is not the end goal, like there's not some teleological process bringing us to that moment, and this is what we should invest in, then it's amazing how useful that can be to reconstruct the things necessary to bind us back together.
Yeah.
And this fact is not weird or new, even though it's created some kind of novel movement inside of current philosophy. Aristotle recognized all of these things as being key and described them as what creates a virtuous society.
Hmm.
He was not rejecting, he wouldn't disagree with anything, I think, that most of the postmoderns would identify as like critical systems of oppression. He would just be like, no, actually, that's just what gives life meaning.
Yeah.
And so I think a big part of this, this is why the label of the postmodern traditionalism is thrown around, is that ultimately this is looking, we're through the looking glass here on a lot of this stuff. And the question is, okay, you've kind of got three paths, right? You can embrace this like never ending liberation in the sense of trying to go kind of the progressive path, where but it's all kind of focused on identity politics and these kind of things. Or you can go for the never ending liberation and kind of the techno optimist sense of like freeing ourselves at all as human, and
No, fuck that.
humanity isn't that great. Ultimately this is a Nietzschean understanding, right? Nick Land is not destroying the human in the sense of like, he doesn't see it destroying the human in the sense of like nothing about humanity is good. He's looking at it in the Nietzschean sense of like humanity is something to be transcended,
Yeah.
and our existence, our intelligence being purified through the capitalist process into something artificial will only just be a better version of what we are now.
Mm.
I also disagree with him, but to give him his due, that is
I think that's demonic.
And so the only it's a Luciferian theophacy, but the only real option then left is to rebind ourselves into something meaningful, to embrace these limitations and recognize that they are actually healthy, and they are what gives us purpose and meaning, and they are what drives us towards an identity that encourages us to transcend ourselves. And so this is why I think contrasting Dugin to Land is interesting, because Dugin is probably the only other person I've seen identify the postmodern condition and identify the acceleration elements inside of it in the same way that Land does. But Dugin's solution is, at the end of this postmodern moment, we re-enter a moment where we can introduce the divine and the transcendent once again.
Yes.
And that's and I don't want to call myself a Duginist. There are many things I disagree with Dugin on, very specifically his geopolitical project and his hatred for all things Anglo. But the reason he's an interesting thinker, and the reason I think it's foolish, a lot of people just discard him, being like, he's just a Russian propagandist. Sorry, I've read his books. I'm not. I don't have an official degree somewhere, but I'm relatively well versed in this corner of thought, and this is a man who is displaying a knowledge that is superior to most in this area. So the idea that yes, he is a Russian propagandist. Yes, you should discount his complaints about Ukraine or whatever. But to the extent at which he is describing the modern condition and possible approaches to its solution, he is more insightful than most give him credit for.
Yeah, I'm
Well, and I
very
think.
much
Oh, go ahead.
sorry,
Sorry.
Slav. Just a quick aside. I'm very much so
Mhm.
interested in Dugin. I've listened to your episodes with Michael Millerman about the fourth political theory, and I've listened to a lot of Dugin's like lectures and stuff that he's done given in English. And something that very much so interests me is like this concept of surrounding modernity from all sides, surrounding it from postmodern critique, utilizing that, but then also encouraging traditionalist pre-modern approaches as well. And I think that that's something that like postmodernism does is it opens the door for if modernity was kind of this process of
You just
um,
cut out, brother.
oh, I cut out.
Yeah, a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Am I back
Let's try
now?
again. Yeah.
All right. Well, if modernity was this process of kind of like eliminating traditional relations and critiquing traditional structures and things like that, then postmodernity is kind of like a process of then now breaking down and critiquing modern structures. And modernity is kind of all built upon this like promise of reason and the rational mindset and everything like that. And so if now we see that that is just one subsect of thought amongst many other approaches, it kind of opens the door to then reevaluate the promise of reason as a whole, and it kind of ultimately kind of bankrupts the entire promise of liberalism itself. So I think that like the destruction of traditional relations has caused lots of problems, but then the destruction of the relations built in liberalism has even caused many problems that we're now seeing in this postmodern movement, where everything is kind of being broken down, deconstructed, boundaries are being kind of completely blown apart,
Yep.
and so we're seeing like all sorts of relations. Nothing's tied to anything. Nothing means anything. Nothing's connected to anyone anymore. Everyone's deracinated. All of this, and it's a horrible thing, and that we're all kind of fighting against, and we don't want that, but I think it's kind of one part in a chain of development that's just kind of inevitable. I think it goes hand in hand with capital in many ways because capital needs that to make new markets. But when, at like a cultural and an individual level, when we've kind of hollowed out all of these different systems and relations, it gives, and even reason and the liberal consensus and stuff, it gives us a moment to kind of look back at all of the things before and evaluate traditional structures and beliefs and wisdom traditions and stuff on the same level as liberalism, whereas like liberalism and scientific materialism and stuff was propped up as this is the end all be all, it's rational, it's reason. It's now kind of being put back into the same playing field or even maybe below some of these previous traditions and stuff like that. And so it opens the back door to faith, it opens the back door to a lot of reestablishing and reconstructing some of these things, but with a whole new light and a whole new consciousness to actually kind of consent to the form and structures that we know that we need and want in society. And so to me, there's like a lot of positive that can come out of this, and it seems like it's something that we just have to kind of poke through and get through the end of it and kind of weather the storm by, like you're saying, building these alternative institutions that can be there as like a lifeline and a little pocket of light that can make it through this darkness, and then hopefully connecting them together and reconstructing something on the other side.
100%. I also, to springboard on that a little bit, I always think about the idea of like in high school I took an auto shop class, and the final for the auto shop class, I'm sure this was one that a lot of people did also, was we took apart a whole engine and then we put it back together. And in the process of taking it apart and then looking at each piece kind of laid out on the table and then reassembling it and having it operate, you kind of understand that's how you gain that proper understanding of each piece, right? It's no longer just this totally opaque magical block that makes your car move. um and I think about traditional structures being disassembled in postmodernity in a similar way. And like how I think we used this language earlier, but like Marshall McLuhan talked about adult converts to the faith in a similar
Mm.
way, as you're coming through the back door into the faith from kind of a starting point of going, I know the end result. As an adult, I kind of in a lot of ways now know the end result of continuing in a secular mode, and I see I see the outcomes of that, and I also see the outcomes of like the religious life, which is also interesting because in my own personal life and engaging in my religion and all things like that, interacting with, you know, people who have never had a moment in their life outside of the church
Mm.
is very different than myself or other adult converts that I know, who have come at it from a very different point of view. And I bring that up specifically because I think that I think that that is going to map onto the wider scale of what we're kind of talking about as it plays out. I'm pretty confident that this will be the way it goes. I mean, especially just identifying how relevant culturally electoral politics are in the United States, just looking at the direction that, you know, Zoomers, young people swung in this last election.
Yeah.
And you know, we're talking about leftists and right wingers. I think that all of those people across that spectrum are animated by the collapse of meaning
Mm-hmm.
and of a meta narrative. And I think that there is just that kind of tired, beat down, like, fine, I'm just going to acknowledge that, like, I get to kind of, in that postmodern way, I get to kind of adopt a certain viewpoint, and like maybe one where like the Father loves me and created me to be this way is better than this animating force of like fuck you dad that I bring to everything else. You know what I mean? Um and yeah, I don't know. Have you I'm jumping around a little bit, but Oren, have you always been religious in your life?
Yeah, I'm very blessed. I was raised by the Cleavers. My parents were incredible people. I mean, they're alive. They're incredible people. And we were in my mom is just always preparing for the next vacation Bible school.
Mm.
There's never a moment in which she is not creating a vacation Bible school.
That
Uh,
rocks.
so so yeah, I was just in the church. Yeah, I'm Southern Baptist, but we moved around a lot when I was a kid. But the Southern Baptist hymnal kind of was my identity. My dad was in the Air Force. We moved every year or two. But the one thing that was like always constant, that was always cultural, was always real, was the church
Mm.
in that sense. Even though I was changing churches very often. And so I look, I gave a speech actually at the Old Glory Club conference last year touching on this, but I understand the problem of modernity because I look around at so many of my fellow, I'm in between the Gen X and millennial. I'm right on that line.
Mm.
But I look at so many of the people in my generation, and so many of them are completely detached from the church, and so they're
Yeah.
trying, they all recognize what you're talking about, which is like, what we were sold is not working. Maybe this thing that I rejected out of hand because culture told me to has more value than I thought it would,
Mm.
but I don't know how to like completely, for me, God's existence has all never been a question. There's always been, am I uncomfortable with, tragedy has entered my life. Am I angry with God? Am I struggling in these moments? But the truth of his existence was always as apparent to me as breathing air. But that's a level of enchantment in the world that just most people don't have
Yeah.
anymore. And so you see that struggle of people trying to get back to it. And it is a real question for a lot of people. But like I said, and we were talking about, I think this is a moment that reintroduces that opportunity for so many.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen. Have you seen? Has there been much of like a growth in your community, like as far as people coming back to the church? Because I've been hearing about that from other people. I myself bounce between a couple of parishes. One of them that is my wife and I are Catholic. One of them is much more traditional, and does the kind of traditional mass, and then another being Novus Ordo post Vatican II, and we kind of just, we're not super factional with that. We kind of like to play both sides a little bit, but obviously one of them is basically geriatric, but then the other is just like bursting at the seams.
Yeah.
There's a new young person every week, right? And I'm wondering if you've seen that growth at all in your community.
I have, and obviously the Protestant structure is a little different. But it's funny that even though the Catholic services are like supposed to be the same and regular, and that's why you can have the same thing no matter what you go with Catholicism, they are actually undergoing kind of a Protestant problem in the sense that like they,
Yep.
The churches that are holding to the older ways are actually have far more momentum, and they're growing, and they're the ones drawing people in, and people will travel from outside of their parish to that parish just to experience this tradition. And ultimately. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, within my own area code, I could probably drive to a parish that would give 3 or 4 different kinds of masses.
Right.
It's very strange.
Well, and that's why if you look at the growth and decline, the mainline Protestant stuff is dying, right?
Yeah.
The guys that are going along with the spirit of the age that bought into all the everybody who thought that being more like the world would be what grew their their church, that stuff is dying out. And all the stuff that is growing is that which is making demands on people, saying, no, there are limitations, there is purpose, and within that, there is identity. And that's what people are looking for. That is the meaning. Who are we? This is the question everyone is trying to answer. And the people who, and the churches that are like, well, we are whatever the world needs us to be, they're dying. And the churches that are saying, no, we are something distinct and set apart, and we will witness to the world, and we will influence the world, but we will be something different. Those are the ones that are growing. And so I don't think there's any mistake that, be it Catholic or Protestant, the churches that are demanding things of people are the ones that are seeing that growth, and the ones that are buying into kind of the current rhetoric are the ones that are withering away.
I'd say
100%. Oh, go ahead. You go ahead.
I just have a personal anecdote on this because I'm kind of like an interesting, like I kind of left the church and then found my way back in through the back door. Like I grew up Protestant, I grew up Presbyterian, and I grew up in like one of these kind of bigger churches that is very modern, pretty secularized, and I very much so believed in God and believed in like a spirit that animated all things and connected everything, and I believed very much so in like the values of the gospel and stuff. But it didn't really seem to be the home for like the image of God that I was kind of given amongst this institution wasn't really in line with what I had experienced in my heart, and experienced in my day to day. And so my kind of understanding of God in a personal way didn't really align at all with like this kind of colder, more sterile, kind of mechanistic approach towards it that was given at the time in my church I grew up in. And it kind of pushed me. I was looking for something more semi-mystical, something more traditional, something that connected more to spirit, and it felt like a lot of that had been kind of taken out. And so I went looking for it, and I left the church, and I kind of experienced like my own kind of personal evolution of thought and like spirit as well, where I kind of like felt like I'm kind of mirroring in a way like the process that happened with like modernity and postmodernity and stuff, where it's like I kind of came to like quote unquote the age of reason, like 13, 14, had my own kind of um, rational revolution in my own brain, where I'm like, oh, I'm going to look for the answers to where God exists in science and this and that and other, and kind of went down that route for a while, and also was very interested in like kind of more mystical traditions of like the East and stuff, because I thought maybe that had a little bit better touch, and also like I was kind of an experimental little kid. I did a bunch of psychedelics and everything, and through all this kind of process I ended up coming to realize that like, oh, there's like a depth of mysticism and meaning and spirituality that is present within the Christian tradition that I just wasn't really getting beforehand. And it took me kind of leaving that and having this like outside perspective, where I realized I wasn't really getting the things I was looking for in the whole package elsewhere. And that kind of this like scientific approach kind of left me with more questions than I had. And then it also oftentimes led to confirming some of the practices of tradition, in a kind of a backdoor way. And so I realized, oh, there's like actually like my individual self and culture resonates with this given wisdom tradition of Christianity. And within it, there is present, monastic kind of more mystical approaches that are more contemplative and that kind of thing that I never really got. And so then I was able to kind of re-enter the church with a fresher understanding of it. And now, like, the realization of Christ is something that is living within my day-to-day life in a way that it never was before. Before, it was something that was kind of a given, maybe more so, or something that I kind of took to be understood, or it was kind of just there. But now it's like something that is actually animating force within my life, because I have openly consented to and consciously worked to consent to the actions of the Spirit within my heart, and listen to the movement of Christ, and really follow him. And so that's something now that's like, I feel like through that process of leaving and kind of deconstructing a lot of things, I was able to reestablish a more meaningful connection to the faith that is actually a living tradition now, rather than a cold kind of guideline. And I think that that's
Mm.
something that I'd like to bring it back to a cultural or broader strokes. I think that's something we have the opportunity for now. Whereas it feels like maybe some of these institutions, like you're talking about, Auron, are like, let's go with the order of the day. Let's kind of be more secular. Let's do this and do that. And it's not offering what people need. It's not offering a real connection to spirit. It's like a bunch of that Western kind of Christianity in many ways that has gone more secular. It's become very translative and not transformative. And like, I think people are needing that transformative kind of vision, like you're saying, that makes demands of people and tells people these are things that, you have to change, you have to do, you have to orient yourself towards life in a positive manner that puts these things in right relation. And I think that we now have an opportunity to kind of really consciously consent to these kind of structures and put them back in place. So I kind of feel as though my own personal experience is kind of like, in a way, can be mapped out on a broader scale to what's going on right now in this postmodern moment.
Yeah, that's a beautiful testimony. And I was wondering, have you guys ever read C.S. Lewis, or not C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton's
Mm,
Everlasting Man?
indeed, yes.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't read Everlasting Man, but I read Orthodoxy.
So I think it's an Everlasting Man, but maybe it's Orthodoxy. Maybe it is Orthodoxy. But either way, if you've read that, you'll be familiar with his story of the man that rediscovered England,
Yes. Yes,
right?
yes, yeah.
And that's exactly what you're explaining, right?
Hmm.
I thought, because I was born into this thing and this thing was taken for granted and it had just been cultural and worn away in so many ways, I abandoned it and I searched the world looking for all these other aspects that I thought I wanted, and I found a little bit here and a little bit there, but it never came together in the way that I really identified with and found to be true. And as I traveled around the world, I finally discovered this land, and it's exactly the temperature I want, and it has exactly the beautiful landscape that I want. And and it turns out he's just returned to England, right?
Yeah.
He's traveled the world, and he's just rediscovered that everything he actually wanted was always there, but because
Mm.
he had not evaluated it, because he had not chosen it, because he had not understood it, because he had taken it all for granted, he had not recognized the kind of the truth and the beauty of it.
Yes.
And I think that's where a lot of people are with Christianity right now. It's
Yeah.
a moment where they got a lot of, like, kind of the 1980s moral majority, barely prosperity gospel, Joel Osteen style Christianity, and they did not realize kind of the depth and power of this thing. They were taught by the school system and by culture that this was a cheap thing to be thrown away and rejected, and that was a mark of maturity and intelligence. But as they have moved through this process of extreme rationalization, they've actually found there's far less truth sitting at the bottom of that glass
Yeah.
than they first understood. And this brings them back to, as you were just pointing out, kind of this moment of realization that there was way more depth in the original thing I was in, and I stepped out of it, discarded it, because in many cases, the leadership was not making this aware to me. This was
Yeah.
not, we were not catechizing properly.
Mhm.
And that is a real issue. But it has brought us back around to this moment where people can reevaluate this in a new way.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of hope in the present moment. Like, I know it's a lot of this deconstruction and everything is very causing a lot of social ills, but I think in my mind there's a lot of hope that is present in this moment right now.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, and I mean, just the thing you guys were just talking on there, and the Chesterton reference. It's like it's so perfect and beautiful, and I've seen that in people in my own life, and like my wife, for instance. She had kind of been interested in kind of, esoteric, kind of pagan, I guess. I mean, it's kind of cringe, but like when we first met, kind of like witch like kind of stuff, right? And that's pretty popular these days amongst the young ladies. And she had talked to me and kind of just like realized, like, talking to me and understanding, like, a lot of the ritual and tapping into something older and everything, she just kind of had this moment where it clicked. And I think one of the big things that she had kind of talked about too was that it kind of became, I think, one of the big radicalizing points she made. She's like, you kind of realize, like, a lot of this shit that I was engaged with didn't have the deep historical well that I actually thought it did. It was kind of a farce a little
Mm.
bit, and that there was a place that did have that well, and it was going back home, and it wasn't this solitary act, right? It was actually communal, as opposed to this, like, hey, let's just tailor make our own thing ourselves. um and I thought that was really special, and it always really stood out to me, and especially in the light of what you guys are talking about. And in this conversation, I've kind of been thinking about this in general. I've been finding, because Oren, you were talking about, you had kind of focused on like your belief in God, right? And I think probably all three of us can safely say, even when I was not involved in religion, um, the existence of God is obviously the most rational explanation for things. It's not, it's the easier case to argue. Um, and I've found that I don't know that is the main thing that I think a lot of newcomers are getting or looking for now, so much as I see people going to faith, and I see them, like what COH was saying, going toward that kind of like sense of enchantment, right? And that kind of mysterious magic, for lack of a better word, that they're getting, that they have been taught to not associate with Christianity,
Yeah.
because Christianity is just boring fucking Ned Flanders, you know sterile.
Mm.
Or, um, from my point of view, I go to the church and I really enjoy the orthodoxy and the formalism, and I like the, like, hey, get serious. These are the rules. You know what I mean? Especially with my own history of, um, alcoholism and things like that. Having a rule set imposed on me feels good, and I have no qualms about needing it, right? Like, submitting to God is kind of much bigger to me than acknowledging that he's there, right? And then lastly, and this is an interesting one, because I feel like this kind of bridges me to you, Oren, culturally a little bit more. My brother is also a Baptist, and he's kind of involved in, um I guess he's kind of involved organizationally, I guess, with what you would say is the kind of Christian nationalist scene community, right? Um, to the extent that it exists, and he really emphasizes how important strength is, and I think that that's also really important, just as far as this, like, this rejection of this modern idea of, like, oh well, gee shucks, I'm just a Christian and it's just all about being a fucking hippie, and mirroring nice polite people, and I'm just gonna kind of be the designated loser constantly. um and so, yeah, I mean, I reduce it to those three things. I'm sure it's more complicated, but kind of orthodoxy, strength, and enchantment seem like really important things that draw people to it. um and yeah, I don't know, I wonder what you think of that. I wonder if you see that. I see other examples of that people move towards in secular spaces also. But, like, what that speaks to, why exactly people are missing that, if I'm onto something in the first place.
No, I think that's right. And I think that ultimately, a lot of Christians were scared of this. So, um, there's this book that has gotten very popular recently for good reason. It's R.R. Reno's Return of the Strong Gods.
Mm.
And
Okay.
in Return of the Strong Gods, R.R. Reno points out that kind of after World War II, uh, there's kind of like the final attempt to kill off the transcendent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we did that for a reason. The transcendent it makes the world a dangerous place. The transcendent is worth dying for by
Yeah.
definition. It's identity, it's faith, it's real things that are existential. And we watched what happened in World War II and kind of said, well, it would be better if we made the world smaller, like bigger in the sense that we like globalized, but smaller in the sense that we push all the existential questions into the broom closet, right?
Yeah.
And we don't want to deal with that stuff anymore. And so we got rid of enchantment and we got rid of orthodoxy and we got rid of identity and we got rid of power. And Christians felt that in a very real way. And so they're in I think a lot of people correctly identified this is what so much of leftist literature is like Christianity is the last vestige of fascism. And what they mean is like it's the last vestige of the old world. Like it's
Yeah.
the thing that has yet to be deconstructed and disenchanted. It's the thumos that drives men's passions still. It can still arouse mobs and crowds and peoples into action. And so Christianity felt that pressure and felt the need to rationalize and kind of dissipate those forces as much as possible so that we weren't scary to people anymore. And but that has never been what Christianity is. Christianity is a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And it always was. It was always a danger to the powerful, even when Christ refused to enter into direct conflict. He toppled the Roman Empire nonetheless.
Yeah.
And so there's a real truth in the fact that the ruling order needed to kind of castrate Christianity and make it this thing that was far more modern and therefore lose its own power. But people are recognizing that those ancient things tied to the meaning of Christianity are actually the things you want.
Yeah.
Like, don't get me wrong, like obviously the core of Christianity is salvation through Christ, but it's not just a message for the next world, it's a message for this world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a connection to the good and the beautiful and the true.
Mm.
And the thing about the good and beautiful and the true is people will die for it. And I
Yeah.
think that's what people are looking for. People are looking for something worth dying for and worth living for, in a world that just wants them to die slowly and quietly while smoking weed and playing video games.
Right.
And I think that is ultimately what is drawing people back.
Yeah, I think
One-
that the depth of
100%.
the lack of meaning and lack of purpose is like one of the major motivating factors for people, I think, kind of returning to the faith and also like trying out, like Slav was talking about, like kind of neo-paganism, kind of stuff like that as well. It's just looking for something that provides a sense of meaning and direction and purpose. And I think that just to bring this back to kind of like for me, a kind of semi-materialist analysis of it, like you're talking about how we kind of dismantled religion and the idea of God and kind of like the motivating factors of religion because they're kind of dangerous. People will die for them. Also, they stand in the way of capital accumulation.
Yep.
When you have the something that connects you to your people, you have an idea of the spirit that connects you to everything around you, and you have this vision of the world being imbued with spirit that's like all sacred and stuff. Capital can't have that because it stands in the way of you willingly exploiting everyone around you and everything around you for just to build profit. And so like one thing that I see capital doing primarily is that it breaks down what's sacred, but it also profanes the sacred. Like it takes these types of relations and everything, and it offers these inverted versions of them that are very much so hollowed out and like I think like in a religious framework, kind of demonic in the sense that they offer the inverse of the good values, the inverse of beauty, the inverse of truth, the inverse of connection to spirit, and they offer them as if they are the real thing. And it does it all nested within the market. So it's just all kind of like it subsumes it in order to make more open market space. And I wonder to kind of bring this back to our discussion about the human security system and everything, how do you rebuild institutions that are able to withstand the force of capital, to wrangle it in some capacity, or at the very least, not crumble beneath its weight and its continued attempts to break it down, or even just wield these institutions for its own benefit?
I spend pretty much all of my time thinking about this.
God, me too. Yeah. Okay.
And I started writing possibly another book, and this is part of it. And I don't have a good answer yet, because this is the question of, I think this is the question facing us going forward.
Yes.
And I think the answer, and this is probably not the answer anyone wants to hear, but I think the answer is we don't, and we smash everything, and then we go back to a life that is more sustainable.
Yeah.
I think the Tower of Babel just comes apart.
Yes.
But when it comes apart, when we, if there is even a technological reset, it will come with these things already existing, right? Like, history is cyclical, kind of, but like it's more like a helix, right?
Yeah.
It goes back onto itself, but it's always moving up a little bit, right? And so there's a reason Nick Land buys into the fact that that kind of capital escape is inevitable.
Yeah.
His case is very good, which is terrifying. But I don't have great answers to that yet, other than exploring along the lines that Dugin has talked about. And one of the key things for Dugin is really the civilizational Dasein, or if you prefer, like the Spenglerian understanding to the Heideggerian understanding, the animating metaphysical spirits of peoples. But this is something that is pretty far out there for a lot of people. But I think that the only thing that actually stops capital from eating us alive is actually distinct peoples separated and binding things inside traditions that solidify their identity in a way that allows them to protect against this corrosive aspect of human existence.
Yeah, kind of recenter around what it is to be truly human within the scope of their existence and their heritage and everything like that. To me,
well, and that makes a lot of sense to me also, just because we talk about like the kind of the leftist project of like we need to disassemble social systems so that like in a way we can be brought back to this basic pure state of nature, which is ironic because they kind of like don't believe in any kind of like sense of human
they want to
nature.
transcend nature into something else, and I think that is like what you're talking about. It's kind of a departure where it's like taking the idea of like a post-human future and saying, well, if capital kind of exits from humanity and moves its like autonomous intelligence force onto machines and stuff, it kind of leaves us behind with this void of figuring out, okay, well, if we're no longer under this kind of compulsion of capital production, then maybe we can find out what it means, if there's any room for us to live truly human lives again.
Well, the funny thing about leftists and their relationship with capital is that Marx loved capital to the extent that it, just like Deleuze and Guattari, that it would deterritorialize, right? Like he famously said, I'm pro free trade as long as it's destroying nations. And so, the Marxists always believed in capital up to a point, but they thought they were going to use capital as like this booster rocket to get them to gay space communism, right?
Yeah.
Like they would discard it at some point, and then it turns out actually capital is just going to discard them.
Yes.
like capital is going to use the left to dismantle as much tradition as it needs to, and then it's going to discard the leftists, not the other way around.
Well, it's funny that you said that too, because as we're talking, gears are kind of slowly turning in my head, and I'm realizing like, this uncoupling of capital, this emancipation of it, in a way is, in this kind of funny postmodern way, is kind of just this reverse engineering of what Marx had talked about, of just like productivity is going to go up, and then we're no longer going to be bound to our original roles in the first place.
And boy, was he right. And monkey's paw, baby, monkey's paw.
Right. No, and it almost makes me wonder if like the actual orthodox Marxists and communists end up being right wingers accidentally.
Yeah. It's dude,
Who
leftism
knows?
leftism is not really a feature of communism, like orthodox communism or Marxism in a lot of ways. It is very much so something that is uh really kind of a cancer upon the actual like use of its analysis in a political like real politics sense.
Hmm.
But that's for another
Yeah.
day.
Well, yeah. There's a big can there, right? But yeah. Well, okay. So you mentioned Dasein, and as I mean, I'm gonna do the funny. I get to be the the guy that people can throw tomatoes at because I'm gonna wade into trying to define that in 2 sentences or less. But basically a sense of place and time that is it basically a zeitgeist, right? It's the animating spirit of a people and a place and a time shared together, right? A culture. What assuming that I didn't just totally fall on my face, which I'm actually kind of impressed with how I just did it. I think I did a pretty good job. What would that be for us? You know what I mean? Because I feel that there is one. And again, I will say credit where it's due. I think that for as much as James Lindsay is a bit of a lolcow. I think that he arrives using the wrong tools. He arrives at an endpoint that is correct when he points out that Marxism is basically a religion. Now, I would say it isn't. It's basically a scientific system, but scientific maybe stretch here, but it's a system that people use like a religion now, and that when you see blue hairs and septum ring victims and people like that, they're going towards communism. This is basically a pursuit of some kind of metaphysical system and a meta narrative, and they're getting some kind of spiritual satisfaction out of it. And I see that, and I see people, that aren't ruined by overeducation going towards other systems for meaning, and I see that common thread, and I find that actually really encouraging. And so, like, what would that animating spirit of the time and place and people be? You're in the hot seat now. Answer immediately.
Yeah, what is this undefined metaphysical thing that we're attempting to grasp and can't define?
Yeah, exactly. Define the undefinable, please.
Yeah, six
Right,
words
no
or
problem.
less.
Yeah, so again, this is something I think about all the time, and so I'm working through Sam Huntington's book "Who Are We," which is very good because Sam Huntington was he's a professor at Harvard. Like he's a lib. He's a very mainstream lib, but he talks pretty openly and honestly about the nature of identity and most importantly the American identity, and he qualifies very clearly, despite his what you would think would be his institutional priors, that Anglo-Protestantism is America. Like that's just the American identity. It always has been, to the extent that America had a kind of a founding ethnic identity, that was it. If to the extent that it incorporated and assimilated new groups to an identity, a spirit, an understanding, that was it. And it will probably always be to some extent the kind of nature of America. Now, Huntington correctly, I think, points out that it has always assimilated, people in a way that other nations simply have not, and that's part of the way that it's been set up. But assimilation always required understanding that this was the core identity. So it's not, you don't need some one drop rule of whatever. But you do need to understand that if you're coming to America, this is what you're signing on for. He even makes the point that Catholics in America are so wildly Protestant that like the bishops from the American Catholic Church offend all of the other Catholic bishops, because they're so Protestant, their understanding of Catholicism.
Oh, absolutely. I also, to that point, you just said too, like, I think in that post-war moment, like, just the mere existence of Vatican II at all kind of proves what you're saying in a
Yeah.
little bit, right? Just this American era, and then you just see this radical Protestantization of the church. You're totally correct.
So, this is something that is probably the core of kind of who America is. A lot of people won't like that. They'll be angry. Oh, well, Maryland, something, whatever. But ultimately, this is kind of, I think, who we are. Now, the question becomes like, is that who we're going to be in the future? And the answer is, of course not. Like, all identity is continuous and changing. Again, true to the extent that postmoderns say that. But at the same time, it needs to call back and have a continuity, right? The Auron MacIntyre in After Virtue said that the thing that decides whether or not a tradition will move forward is its willingness to address epistemological crisis and overcome them. And currently we have like a deep epistemological crisis. Like, we have turned truth into this hyper rational thing. That's why Marxism fails ultimately. While it has some value in analysis, it is completely materialistic, and therefore avoids certain aspects of the human experience that limit its understanding.
That's where I depart from it.
It's kind of the ultimate push for a materialist system.
Big time.
In a lot of ways.
It has the power of a microscope, in that when you look through it with one eye, you can see entire realms you never would see. And if you continue to look at it with one eye for your entire life, you're going to get hit by a car. It's useful in a moment to analyze certain things. But if you try to make it your total understanding of the world, you will create a system that kills 100 million people. And so, in a similar way, we need to be willing to adapt and understand the American identity and the spirit and the zeitgeist of who we are, in relation to the things we've gone through and where we're going, but without losing the connection to the past that gives us the definition of kind of what we are.
Yeah.
And that's a incredibly difficult project, and will probably not be solved in our lifetime. But I think it is the project going forward, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do is find the path that kind of gets us there. But we are getting close to. I gotta go here in a minute. But,
Definitely. Well,
that's so funny. By the way, just as a side note, I totally forgot about time zones in the beginning. I was like, we won't use all that time, and
no, there's no way we'll go on that long. Yeah.
No, it's a much smaller window, because from the West Coast, I was like, that's like 5 hours. Good. But I'm just being a silly Billy. So this was amazing. This is a great ending point.
Yeah.
A really great point. COH, why don't you kind of take the baton here?
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Auron. I've still got a lot I'd like to speak with you about in the future, so I definitely hope to have you on again sometime. And as I see it, yeah, I think you're 100% right. That is the order of the day, is figuring out that question. I think that's what I like so much about you. Even though I think like I said before, we maybe come from different backgrounds and lineages as far as thought goes. I really like that. I think we're both trying to figure out the same thing. I think we're both trying to provide a pro-human future that connects people to their heritage, connects people to each other, connects people to spirit, and places everything in the right relation to one another. And I think that it's going to take a lot of people looking at different approaches to try to figure it out. And I really commend you for being open-minded and gracious in that respect, being willing to come and talk to us, a couple of crypto commies. And I really
not that crypto, but yeah, no.
I do definitely much so appreciate it. And I look forward to speaking again sometime. Oh, before we go, plug where people can find you and all your writing and everything.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. Got the Auron MacIntyre show. And thank you for having me, guys. It's a pleasure talking with you. I always enjoy these conversations. But got the Auron MacIntyre show. It's on Blaze TV. It's on YouTube. It's on all the podcast platforms you'd expect. And then I've got my book, The Total State, which should be coming out in audiobook soon as well. So if people have been waiting for that to give it a try, they can do that. But that's where I get into a lot more of the issues of scale and dehumanization and some of the themes that we've talked about here. So if people want to know more, that's a good place to look.
And did you narrate the audiobook?
I did not. Yeah, it's a weird thing with the audiobook stuff, but they kind of sell those rights to other people, and
Sure.
it gets all over the place. So
Well, I look forward to getting it and listening to it. I listen to a lot of audiobooks at work, so that'll definitely be on my docket as soon as it's available. All right, Auron, we'll have a great week. Have a good Thanksgiving, and then I hope to catch up with you soon.
Absolutely. Thanksgiving, guys.
These people are sick. This is obviously a very, very sick individual. These people are the sickest of them all. These people are sick. They are sick.
I
And
still
you better
can't
get used to hearing
the
it.
outro.
These people are sick.